Hello, my name is Dr. Gerard Toal and welcome to this lecture which addresses the question, why was the collapse of Yugoslavia violent and that of the Soviet Union not so violent? This is part of Module 2 of my course, Topics in Political Geography, which has been offered in the spring of 2017 at Virginia Tech. In this lecture, what I want to do is provide a flavor of, an introduction to the arguments of Veljko Vujacic, whose book Nationalism, Myth and the State in Russia and Serbia was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. This builds on some previous articles that he wrote. So those of you who are not able to purchase the book, you'll get some sense of the arguments from these articles, which I'll make available to you. This lecture is not a substitute for reading. I really want you to read these articles. You'll get a lot more out of the articles if you engage with them. But it will provide you some sense of the arguments, where he's coming from, and so on and so forth. So let's get to it. So Vujacic is a professor of sociology at Oberlin College in Ohio, and he is a scholar who uses the work of the foundational sociologist Max Weber, a German sociologist who wrote in the late 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And so he goes back and he looks at Weber's work, and he seeks to bring out the definition and understanding of the nation in Weber's work. So Weber defines the nation as subjective belief in common descent, and more broadly he refines that by talking about the nation as a cultural community of shared memories and a common political destiny, striving for prestige and territorial political power. Now, in the literature on nationalism, Weber's work has been somewhat marginalized. So Vujacic is seeking to do something here. He's seeking to pull back the work of Weber into a discussion. This is, I think, very important and useful because Weber's understanding of the nation really emphasizes the affective qualities of the nation. He emphasizes shared memories, he emphasizes prestige, status, feeling, emotion. So those are things that are really crucial to this course and to this particular module. Let's talk about a few other concepts which sort of build upon the work of Weber. So Weber argued that the national solidarity that comes into being, and really we're talking about nationalism not as something that is primordial, but really came into its own in the 19th century. But it's a product of negative formation against others. So there's a quality that the self is defined in opposition to an other. And that in that particular process of boundary formation is tied up with feelings of prestige and status, feeling superior, or a resentment and frustration, feeling that you have been oppressed by another nation which is seeking to lord it over you. Weber emphasizes the importance of historical experiences as the basis for this subjective identification. So it's not a theory based on primordialism. If you're Catholic, therefore you're inevitably going to become part of a certain nation. Or even if you speak a certain language, like you speak German, you're necessarily going to identify with Germany. He gives certain examples. He gives the example of the Swiss nation and its sense of solidarity, which didn't come out of common language, and then the example of the Alsace Germans, who tended to identify more with France than with Germany. And then there's also other examples from the Balkans. This emphasis on historical experience and subjective identification means we have to pay attention to how people understand their historical experiences. So it's not simply the historical experiences themselves, but how they're translated into memories and translated into myths and translated into senses of belonging. Now, two categories which are part of the Weberian tradition that we need to pay attention to. A Kulturträger it's simply a German term, a portmanteau term, squashing together the German term for culture and bearer. So Kulturträger is it draws our attention to the intellectuals and the institutions that transmit cultural ideas from generation to generation. So those working in the Weberian tradition really pay attention, and this is true of most scholars of nationalism. They're very much paying attention to the intellectuals, the poets, the writers, the dramatists, the newspaper editors, as well as those later, when it becomes institutionalized, those that are writing textbooks, those are the historians that are providing the narrative of the nation. And if they're in the absence of kind of official, recognized, and widely distributed histories, then particular stories, novels, which capture the spirit of the nation, which seek to coalesce that. So there's an emphasis on that within the Weberian tradition. The second notion is of mythomoteur. And this is a French term which combines the idea of myth with moteur is French for engine. So it's the constitutive myth, and let me see if I can bring it out here. The constitutive myth that gives an ethnic group its sense of purpose. This is something that is associated with the work of John Armstrong and Anthony Smith, who write on the ethnic origins of nations, the ways in which certain myths of nations prior to the era of nationalism from the French Revolution onwards, those particular stories and how those stories, initial constitutive stories from the 16th, 17th century, then get worked into the era of nationalism and become motors for a sense of collective identity. Now, the last term, ressentiment, is again another French term which essentially means resentment. So we're looking at the hostility directed at perceived cause of one's victimhood, the assignment of blame for one's frustration, or for one's lowly status, or for one's misfortune. These are really important concepts, and there's a lot of writing on them in the study of nationalism. But they all deal with affect. They deal with the kind of transmission of senses of identity, of memory, of belonging, and of feelings of identification. They deal with the kind of heroic stories, and then they deal with who to blame. They deal with hate in one sense, and that this notion of hate in opposition to another group or another oppressive institution is extremely important. And so these concepts are ones that Vujacic and others use in order to try to explain their question. And this question is the one that he seeks to answer in this book, which came out in 2015. And what he's doing here, he's using ideal type theorization, which is something that Weber used in his sociology, to sort of push for clarification on the necessary things which are sort of common or which are found in multiple cases, the necessary as opposed to certain contingent or not necessarily or supplementary elements in a causal analysis. And so the causal analysis is how to explain this particular outcome. So you identify a puzzle. In this case, he's identified the case of why did the elite within Serbia operate in one way as opposed to in Russia, where they had a different attitude towards the borders that were constituted after the collapse of the federal communist systems, the federal communist states that collapsed, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. So he seeks to identify historical antecedents and then contextual factors. Now, actually in his work, especially in the book, there's less discussion of the contextual factors. And that's something that you can get from various histories and so on and so forth. He's aware of it, but he doesn't go into great detail on that. He's really interested in the historical antecedents. Now, there are other particular accounts of the collapse which really emphasize the importance of leadership, of proximate factors, of sort of contingency, of timing, and so on and so forth. And those are compelling arguments. He wants to make an argument which is really about structural legacy and institutional legacies. And he makes an argument for what he calls interpretive adequacy. He needs to be able to account for a culturally specific motivation of political action. That's the sort of test, as he sees it, of Weberian analysis. So Vujacic is really concerned with his work passing muster in terms of social science, and that's why he has large passages in his book which engages with Weberian analysis as a particular methodology. So in just to kind of graph this out a little bit more for you, so the necessary antecedent conditions are historical legacies, and he makes a distinction in the book between historical legacies which are indirect and sort of mediated, and then collective narratives which are direct and immediate, which sort of translate sort of objective experiences or objective events, history as it unfolded, but then how is that narrated? How is it pulled into a story which has it make sense and has it have meaning for a particular community, and has it assign blame and assign victimhood and so on and so forth. Then there's the discussion, there's context, and here I'm simply just alerting you to the fact that there's a whole sociological literature on this very vague term called context. So the conjunctural interactions, the contingent events and how they unfold, processes, eventful processes. There's a historian by the name of William Sewell who talks about eventful processes. Rogers Brubaker is another sociologist who also theorizes these things. There's a whole literature on turning points, breaking points in history. And the particular identification of these. And then there's a literature on what are called path-dependent reactive sequence causal chains. Don't get too worried about that particular phraseology. Essentially what that path-dependent means that is there's a certain fork in the road, and because you've taken one particular path, then you are on a whole other set of subpaths because of that, as opposed to another having taken another path. So that's a kind of key fork in the road, a key turning point. The reactive sequence is simply you are reacting to what others are doing. You're reacting to your perceived enemy. You're reacting to other nations within the state that are pursuing their particular projects, and there's a sort of interactive dynamic that unfolds. And then the causal chain is that this particular set of interactions then leads to particular outcomes, and so on and so forth. I tend, in my own work, I tend to emphasize the contingent contextual nature of the unfolding of history and of contemporary affairs, because I do think that there's these historical legacies are sort of protean and can be shaped and reformed in very, very different ways. And the key is to look at the leader who has the power to do that, to constitute them and make them have certain meaning. The key is to really look at the particular storylines that are being generated and the institutions that have the power to generate those storylines, and the degree to which they are challenged or not within the society. If you have an authoritarian state where the media is in the hands of the ruling party and the leader, the presidential administration only, then you're going to get a media environment which is conducive to the domination of life by one particular storyline and the marginalization of others. Of course, in our own society, we have great challenges to that, because in many instances, the dominant group will seek to assert truths, which are not necessarily factual. And of course, that's part of the world that we live in. Okay, so let's talk about the puzzle and the argument in summary. So, why did elites in the dominant nation challenge the Republican borders in Yugoslavia, but not in the Soviet Union? And here we're talking about the power elites, those that are in power, those that are in positions of power within the political structures, but also the cultural structures, the media, the academies of sciences, as well as the military, and then the police, and so on and so forth. So why did these particular elites operate in certain ways? Now, one of the problems that I have with this book is that, in one sense, it's not a fair comparison, because on the one hand, the Soviet Union was a very, very complex and major empire. It's a great power, and we're dealing with great power, the great power nation, and when we're looking at the case of Russia, whereas in the case of Yugoslavia, we're dealing with a medium power at best, small, and we're dealing with a small nation and its particular imperial vision. That in part doesn't mean that there are not smaller nations which are oppressed by it. And just because we have a small power does not mean that that power is not imperialist in some of its particular visions of its territory, and so on and so forth. But it is to a certain extent a certain apples and oranges. But okay, leaving that aside, what are some of the arguments that he wants to make? Well, he wants to argue that there are contrasting historical experiences, that Russia is inevitably caught up in imperial understandings of itself, versus Serbia as a nation state which created itself or had its war of independence against the Ottoman Empire. And even though it never was fully homogeneous, and to this day is not fully homogeneously Serb, because there are other nations, other peoples living within Serbia, that experience is a very different one. So Russia has a much longer history than Serbia as a particular place. There are different attitudes towards the state, and there's a particular deep resentment of the state within Russian history and within Russian culture, which doesn't exist to the same extent in Serbia. At least that's the argument he wants to make. And then there are different constitutive myths, the mythomotors, and these become narratives which are available for mobilization. And lastly, there are certain institutional formations and dynamics, in particular, nature of the structuring of Yugoslavia as a federation as opposed to the Soviet Union, which were really, really quite consequential. Yugoslavia had a series of different constitutions, and in one of those constitutions, Serbia itself, even though it was the dominant republic, was subdivided into Kosovo and Vojvodina, and that was a source of major resentment on the part of more Serb nationalist elites in Belgrade, who saw that Serbia itself was being victimized by being part of Yugoslavia, by communist Yugoslavia. Let's talk about those mythomoteurs. The key one is the Kosovo myth in the case of Serbia. And it is in very, this is sort of classic romantic stuff, which is what you find in a lot of nationalist discourse and imaginations and understanding. This is a very famous painting from the 19th century, the Kosovo girl, kind of providing water to a warrior fighting against the this is the Battle of Kosovo, in which the Serb nation supposedly lost against the Ottomans but won a heavenly victory. But the understanding is that you have a heroic suffering nation versus the Ottoman Empire and its particular agents. So what's important here is that Serbian nationalism is defined in reaction to Islam and Muslims, and that there's a sense even that Muslims who have for centuries lived in the Balkans were in one sense part of the Ottoman yoke, which oppressed the organic heroic Serb nation. So that's a particular ideology. The Kosovo myth is of of giving up an earthly kingdom in order to then win a spiritual kingdom in the heavens, and then that spiritual kingdom being a higher form of victory. Now, of course, this is also just very romantic stuff to justify losing a battle. And that battle in and of itself was a dynastic battle. It was one that was not understood in the terms of modern nationalism at the time. There were many different forces, many different religions fighting, and it was more of a dynastic struggle than anything else. Now let's look at the mythomoteur that Vujacic looks at in the case of Russia. And his book has a detailed discussion of the ways in which there is a dual Russia throughout Russian history. And it is an understanding of Russia as being dual in that there's a heroic suffering nation which is Christian, and then there is a state which sometimes identifies with the heroic nation but other times is a cruel imperial nation which is interested in itself and oppresses the nation. So let me read to you from page 101 here, where he talks about the idea of Holy Rus. And here he's talking about the time of troubles, which is really from the late 16th century to the early 17th century, from 1598 to 1613. And he identifies the term Holy Russia as really beginning at this time. And after that, it acquired a particular meaning. This new meaning suggested the existence of an Orthodox Christian realm that recognized the sovereign Tsar, but could seek Christian salvation independent of his officialdom. The idea that Russia was the holy land of Orthodox Christians who could seek salvation independently of the state represented a potential antithesis to the ideology of the Third Rome, which equated Christianity with the Tsar and his, inverted commas, state. What that means is that you have Ruski as a term, and of course this is variable, and you have to be very careful about this, but that dual Russia between Ruski and Rossiani is that in part this the political state, which can be extremely cruel, and then you have the authentic, noble, organic nation. So that's the dual Russia that he discusses, and it is one that he finds in the Tsarist period from the 16th century onwards, and then of course he works it through the 20th century, where the cruel empire and its agents is it's Bolshevism, it's Stalinism, it is the cruelty of the state as opposed to the heroic suffering nation. Now, there's an emphasis and a really excellent chapter in this book on writers. And I just want to say a little bit about that and kind of contrast the figures that he discusses. So the first set of figures he discusses are Vasily Grossman and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So Solzhenitsyn is a famous dissident from the Soviet Union who wrote the Gulag Archipelago and a series of other books, went into exile in the United States, later went back after the Soviet Union collapsed. He is a neo-Slavophile, someone who believed in he wanted a Russian nation state, but a Russian nation state that extended beyond the borders of the legacy, the Soviet Russia that became the Russian Federation. So he believed that Kosovo, or that Crimea and northern Kazakhstan, for example, should be part of Russia. So he represents one particular tradition which is critical of the Soviet state, and in his writings he brings out this sort of authentic peasant Russia, which is inherently noble and good, as opposed to the vicious, cruel Stalinist state. A different figure is the figure of Vasily Grossman, whose book Life and Fate, which deals with World War II, also provides you with an account of an authentic Russia that is seeking to free itself from Stalinism and of the state. Grossman's book was not published during his lifetime. He died in the 60s. His book was only published in the 80s and later became recognized as a classic. Unlike Solzhenitsyn, Grossman was Jewish, and he had no sympathy for this romantic Slavophile kind of tradition out of which Solzhenitsyn worked and thought. So that is so he's a Westernizer as opposed to a Slavophile, a neo-Slavophile. But in both cases, you have in their writings, which were read tremendously in the late 1980s with Glasnost. You suddenly had these books published. But in both cases, you have a picture of the state as being oppressive. Contrast that to Dobrica Kosic, whose work, A Time of Death, there's 4 volumes of it, offer a different understanding and a working of the Kosovo myth. So let me read you a little bit about Kosic. So Dobrica Kosic's Vreme Smrti, means a time of death, was possibly the politically most influential novel written by any Serbian author in the post-World War II period. Published in 4 volumes between 1972 and 1979, a period of renewed ideological orthodoxy in Yugoslavia, Vreme Smrti became an instant bestseller. By 1978, the first 2 volumes of Kosic's tetralogy were already in their 8th printing, having sold 39,000 copies, a considerable achievement for any Yugoslav author. Most importantly, his novel challenged communist orthodoxy from a Serbian nationalist point of view. The challenge was all the more significant as it was by an author who had been a prominent partisan in wartime and a leading communist writer thereafter. Now you can read further on Kosic. He's a very interesting figure, but someone who became alienated from Tito and became inspiration and ideologue of a new Serbian nationalism. And he was a key figure behind the Serbian memorandum, which charged that there was a genocide occurring against Serbs in Kosovo, and this gave rise to a new rhetoric which was racist against Muslims and which provided justification for Serb nationalism in the name of reasserting Serbia's historic position within Yugoslavia, but also reasserting a vision of Yugoslavia as a Serboslavia. And so it's his work, instead of challenging the state, reinforces the state, but it reinforces the state by drawing upon this romantic conception of the state having lost its connections to the authentic nation and now needing to re-establish those. Kosic was, in one sense, an architect of what became genocide against the Bosnian Muslims in the 1990s. Okay, so the necessary antecedent conditions. Now you can read in various of the particular articles that I will provide you with his account of these. So the prior history, Serbia a nation state, Russia an empire, the identification with the state, more so in Serbia, not so critically against the state within Russia. So therefore Russia at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union was more likely to have identification with peripheral nationalisms that were rebelling against the Soviet states. So the Baltic states, the Moldovans, a little less so the Moldovans, but yes, certainly Georgia. So this is Yeltsin's identification and his attempt to try to mobilize, make common cause with the revolt against Moscow Central. Then the critical differences in collective memory, the Holy Rus versus the Kosovo mythomotor, and then the different state institutional structures which empowered in the case of Serbia and inhibited in the case of Russia the beginnings of restorationist geopolitics. Now, of course, the big question is, well and good. Okay, so he provides an explanation of this. He's about to finish his book, and then Crimea happens in 2014. So how do you explain the fact that in actuality we did get a revanchist, restorationist, territorial, enlarged vision coming from Russia? But it came 2 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I will provide you with his postscript to his book so that he can explain that particular issue. This is one that we will look at also in the next module. Okay, this is an overview, an introduction to his work. No substitute for reading it, but hopefully it will have stimulated you to pick up these articles and to get more out of them by reading them. Okay, thank you.